Welcome to Corporate Law Lab. I'm Neil Taylor, Director of the Corporate Law Center at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Opportunities are what you make of them. That's what today's guest, Stephen Ewald, General Counsel at Medpace, learned firsthand as he navigated his legal career. From landing an in-house role right out of law school, to building a successful career in financial services, to leading a corporate legal team in the healthcare space, Steve's story is a testament to the power of hard work, adaptability, and seizing the moment. In this episode of Corporate Law Lab, we dive into the lessons he's learned along the way, the challenges of transitioning between in-house and private practice, and why mastering the details can make or break a deal. You can hear more from Steve as he'll be one of our featured panelists at the 34th Annual Corporate Law Symposium on March 7th at the University of Cincinnati College of Law, an event you won't want to miss. Registration details are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and here's our conversation with Steve. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Glad to be here. Back at my old school, but this isn't my old school, just name only.
Yeah, but as we were talking in the elevator, it's quite an improvement over the dingy, dark one-window place that you and I went to law school.
Massive upgrade. You can get some vitamin D here.
So you graduated, as you said, from UC Law in 1994, I think?
94, yep.
And you went to UC undergrad as well?
I did, so double Bearcat.
Wow. And I was interested, you started in-house at Fifth Third. That was your first job out of school, which was kind of unusual at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. It actually helped shape my career, quite frankly, because I proudly say I was probably the last person in the first-year class going into summer to get my job. And I basically took what I could get. This was a temporary contract review job. But by the end of the summer, I had a permanent offer for after law school. So I use that as a and there's many more details to that, but I use that as a bit of a story for people to always remember that opportunities are what you make of them, right? Take opportunities when they come along, but what you can make of it is up to you. So I was very fortunate to have been able to turn that into something that, through hard work, quite frankly, but into something that I never would have expected. This was, 1992. It was, shall I say, not the greatest job market for lawyers. And I remember, looking for all kinds of opportunities. I sent letters to every law firm in Cincinnati. I still actually, for sentimental values, I have kept some of that paper stock. It was gray paper stock and real heavy because I said that'll impress people, and sent my resume and individually written cover letters, pre-PCs and all that stuff. I had a computer, but it was dot matrix printer, so I had to use my old word processor. And I have a stack of 30 to 40 rejection letters, and I sent out probably about 50 letters, so that tells you how many didn't even get responded to. But I found that job really responding to an ad, and I will tell you, it was not the greatest summer job ever. Pretty mundane, but it really turned into something great, and that launched what I ended up doing my entire career.
So how was it starting in an in-house role coming out of law school? Because, did Fifth Third at the time have like a training program for young lawyers? No,
nothing. And to be clear, I was in a subsidiary of Fifth Third. It was called Midwest Payment Systems, which ultimately became Vantiv, is now WorldPay.
Okay.
Man, if I had stayed there. Anyhow, it's turned out okay. No, they were actually kind of an independently operated subsidiary. We weren't terribly accountable to the main legal department, and it was pretty entrepreneurial. So everything was a little bit different in that group. And no, formal training was not part of it. I was shown a desk in an office with a couple other people and a stack of contracts, and they said, here's your task, go do it. And that was basically it. And in fact, the lawyer that I was working for was also UC grad, was out that summer because he was studying for the bar. So he wasn't even there. So there was no lawyer that was directly supervising me during that summer. I was working directly with the business people. So yeah, it was definitely sink or swim on your own.
But obviously enough interest in it that you joined them
Yeah.
on that permanent job?
Yeah,
and did
yeah.
that
So I started asserting myself into things. I think the opportunity turned out to be great because I don't think they realized the gaps that they had and what they needed. And in the process of dealing with this contract project, I actually identified some significant gaps that they had. And that led to rewriting some of their standard templates, and that got their attention. They said, "Hey, wait a second, maybe we could use a little additional support here." So it worked out nicely that way. But again, it was a lot of hard work and a lot of innovation, and being in the right place at the right time.
So rewriting templates is one of my particular interests, just to show that I have really strange interests. But I found that so much of what our in-house legal department was doing at various places that I've been was explaining things that we had written poorly in templates.
Yeah, it actually is something I still face here, 30 years in practice, generally on the other side of the table, where lawyers actually, they don't even know what they're reading sometimes, but because that was the template they always had. So instead of actually adjusting it to make it, even updating it to current standards or something fit for purpose, they do exactly that. Well, this is our policy, this is market, which is, I love hearing that. This is market based on what? Yeah. Show me the market. There is no market, right? This is what you think I'm going to want to hear, and if you say that, you think that that'll be compelling, but it very rarely is.
I used to have it happen all the time that contract managers would have to escalate to me something they understood very well, but the other side was doing well, this is market, and what the reality is that neither my contract manager nor the person they were negotiating with had any authority to do anything but work off of a particular form.
Right.
And it used to frustrate them so much that they would escalate to me. I wouldn't agree to talk to the person they were talking to. I would say, tell them to get their boss too.
Yeah.
And 10 minutes later, it would be worked out. And
because the business would say, this is dancing on the head of a pin. Here's where the real business term is, and they do the risk assessment. Right. Yeah.
But it frustrated people, and I used to always say to them, I understand that that's not the way the world should work. But unfortunately, it's how it does work. That for some reason, when I'm saying it as deputy GC or GC, it's different than when you're saying it as a contract manager, even though you're using the same words.
It's 100% correct, and I think some of it has to do with the fact that as you elevate within a legal department, particularly in-house, obviously, a little different in law firms, but it still rings a little bit true. You move more from a pure assessor and making recommendations to actually a risk manager where you're making calls, which is what I like. That's what I like about being in-house, is that I get to be a lawyer, but I also get to do more than issue spot and say, here's the problems, and leave it, right? I actually come in and say, here's the problems we found, and here's your solution, what I recommend you should do. And sometimes I get veto rights, right? There are some areas where I don't care what the business says. It's ultimately going to be my call. But most areas, it's, hey, I recommend you do this, and I'm pretty pragmatic. I don't get as mired in some of the archaic components. With that said, though, and this comes back to like even my first job, one of the things that I advise a lot of lawyers on, try to guide and mentor, is the boilerplate does matter. Everyone ignores it, but that's actually where the real issues are going to happen if you have a dispute. So you do need to know and understand it. The understand takes years. You can read those words as many times as you want. I'm still training people constantly on, for instance, indemnification. And everyone's hair's on fire. Oh, indemnification, you can't touch indemnification. You read the words and it says, this is third-party indemnification. It isn't between the two of us. It's if somebody else comes over and says, I'm suing you because what the counterparty did on the contract. So tell me a scenario where that happens very often. And when you start going through the scenario, or when you start going through the scenarios, people start to realize, oh, okay, so maybe that isn't the one to fight over. But then there's also a strategic point, and I'm going to bounce around a bit, which is your boilerplate is also where you negotiate a heck of a lot. That's where your gives and takes can be. You throw all this crap in the boilerplate, and if you sense your counterparty is all up in arms about something, you can give in that space, right? Because those are the lawyer scenarios. That's when the world has blown up, and if you ever get to those provisions where they're going to matter, it's scorched earth anyhow, right? But it's also a very low probability, and I always weight that with I look at the probability and the impact, right? And so if it's a very low probability but company-ending impact, I'm going to hold my ground. If it's a very low probability and not quite so company-ending impact, that's the easy thing to give. But it goes to your point about the escalation. People lower in the organization or in the trenches, so to speak, one, even if they know that, won't have the credibility to make that call and shouldn't, right? Because they need to be supervised. But that's what we get to do if things are escalated to you, right? You get to dig in, and then you become the smart person that solved it, even though
And
those are things you've done before.
it brings to my mind another point in that I was always trying to get the business on important negotiations. I wasn't going to go to them for every single negotiation, just couldn't. But to try and do things in tandem, because if a business person came to me and said, right, we've settled all the business issues, now you do the legal stuff. And I'd say, but I got nothing left to trade.
Yeah.
Right? I have all these things I have to have, and now it's going to be a slow and ponderous negotiation because you've traded everything that you had to give on your side already. And if we're up against somebody like, in the 90s, Microsoft was my favorite, because they would literally say things like, we're Microsoft, we don't change these
They don't
things.
change anything.
Ever.
That hasn't changed, by the way.
Okay, good to know.
I do our enterprise contract with Microsoft. We haven't gotten much from them.
Yeah, I won't tell the story on the podcast for everyone, but it was an indemnification clause where I was essentially indemnifying Microsoft if one of my customers sued them about I was a distributor.
Yeah.
I wasn't doing anything but selling their stuff. And they wanted me to indemnify them, and I'm like, okay, well, now I have said it. So Microsoft, if you're listening, you should probably look closer at that. But I had to escalate that one to the CEO. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure that it ended up getting done in a, don't worry, we'll never sue you for that note in some bottom of someone's drawer, as opposed to actually getting them to change anything. Now, I told you before we started the tangents were okay, and now I went off on my own. So
It's all right. That keeps it interesting.
So you left, I referred to it as Fifth Third,
That's
but it was
fine.
the payments. And something that you don't see often in a CV is you left a starting in-house role and joined a white shoe New York law firm in North Carolina, Cadwalader. How did that come about?
Well, I actually made a very conscious decision, which was I felt I was not developing sufficiently as a lawyer. So in my time, I was at Fifth Third for 5 years, 2 years while in law school, which, I guess it's okay to say now since I have my diploma, but I worked probably about 30 to 40 hours a week during my second year and even more during my third year. So I was working almost full-time and going to school. But in those 5 years, I did legal jobs, I did hybrid business jobs, and I did legal jobs again. So they just kind of moved me around. I was very much a utility player as I was advancing the organization. But I didn't really feel like I was growing as a lawyer. And obviously, I'd invested so much of my energy in becoming a lawyer. I love the business and the entrepreneurial side, but I still wanted to be a lawyer. And I said I really needed to gain that deeper legal experience. And this was in '97. And candidly, I ended up in North Carolina because I did a national search. I had interviewed in Ohio. I didn't really look in Cincinnati. We were kind of at a point in our lives where I said, we've been here for 9 years. Let's do something different. So I was interviewing in Cleveland, but I kept getting these hits in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I didn't know where Charlotte was, to be honest with you. I didn't know much about it, but at that time, Charlotte was becoming the significant. They were the third largest banking center in the country. You had New York, San Francisco, Charlotte, and it was mostly Nations Bank, First Union, a couple others, but I kept getting these hits down there, and so I said, well, the heck, let's try some of that out. And I interviewed with multiple firms. I'd go down, and you'd have your experience where the firms would split the fees, the costs of bringing me down, and I'd go to multiple firms. I did Southern firms, which were, if you've seen the movie The Firm, this was the experience. They took you went to somebody's house for a reception, and they took you to a dinner where people, challenged each other to shots and things like this. This is all lawyers. And then Cadwalader did zero whining dining. It was all business, and it was the partner I was supposed to be interviewing with was so busy he wasn't even there, so I interviewed with another partner. But I'd spent a whole week down there, multiple firms, and I get home on a Thursday, and I walk into our apartment, and my wife says, Steve Cohen called. I said, oh, which one was that? And she said, it's CAD something. I'm like, oh, he told me your offer. I'm like, what? I already have an offer. So I did end up getting one from one of the other firms too, but there was something about the real no-nonsense business here. So you asked me, how I ended up there. I ended up there by a very conscious decision to want to seek a job outside of in-house to gain that experience. I picked CWT for probably all the wrong reasons that turned out to be the right reasons. They were the first one on the table, but there was something that I said, I kind of like this energy and this dynamic. And they also were very keen to bring me in as a mid-level. They were just growing in Charlotte, and they were coming into the turf of all the local firms, either Charlotte firms or out of Atlanta or out of Winston-Salem, whatever. And they needed someone who wasn't a partner, but wasn't a first year, because they'd done good first-year recruiting. So there was a nice opportunity where I could take some of my experience. I could actually get credit for my experience, because a lot of these firms weren't going to give me a lot of credit for that. So I got a couple years credit, and that helped me this was all lockstep in those days. Probably still is, I don't know. But then I was thrown into it. And I will tell you, I say to this day, I gained more experience and knowledge and understanding how to be a lawyer in my time there than any other period of time as a lawyer. I was billing north of 3,000 hours a year, and I was a notorious underbiller. I was working easily 6 days a week, sometimes 7, and I was thrown right into transactions day one. I got there, and I was doing syndicated lending work and securitization work and all of that, and I was given a credit agreement, which in those days were 3 inches thick. We didn't have black lining. You used a blue pen and a ruler, and sent it off, hand wrote it, and sent it off to word processing. I mean, it was a very different day and time. But within about 3 weeks, I was scheduled on a plane up to New York to do my first closing, and I had to go to the partner that I worked for, and I go, "What's a closing?" I had not done that. So what am I expected to do? And we spent about 5 minutes on that, and I went up there, and I'll never forget this deal. I should probably find to say it. I don't think the company still exists. It was called TransCare. It was an ambulance company, and it was a financing, and I had to learn in a very short period of time credit agreement, security agreement, how to perfect on 350 ambulances, how to set up the scissors racks in a closing room, and all this stuff. My first closing, and I remember I was up about 36 hours straight on that closing, working to the middle of the night, all by myself. And I would do the work, and then I'd hand it to the partner. They'd review it. But over that period of time, because of the intensity, it's like immersion. It's like learning a foreign language or something like that. It was so impactful, and it hardwired me how to be attentive to detail, survive under pressure, be creative in your solutions, and really just stand up with confidence, because you had to. I mean, the partner that I worked for showed up. He didn't know anything about the deal. Took me aside, said, "What?" He could ask the key terms there, and I'm looking at him like, he could see on my face, like, "What are you doing here?" He goes, "Don't worry, they just need to see the gray hair." That was what he said to me. And he was a great lawyer. Still, probably is retired now. But the point was, he was there to make sure the client had confidence in the firm, and I was there to reinforce that by getting it done right. And this is where, the devil in the details. It was what Steve told me all the time, and when we'd sit down and review things together, very, very attentive to that. And I've never forgotten these lessons. They're ingrained in me now. And the point I make is especially early in your career, it's really important to work hard, very hard. Get yourself in pressure cooker situations. You want to be a good lawyer and have a long career. That is a very important part of your training. School doesn't teach you a thing about that. They'll teach you nuts and bolts and theory and, very importantly, the way to think. You do not learn really how to be a lawyer until you're in the job. And your first couple jobs or your first job, it's so important that you embrace it that way. And I will tell you, I do see we bring people in from here, we bring people in from other schools. There's an attitude that seems lacking around that. If you want to be a good lawyer, you have to be ready to work really hard. You worked hard in law school, but in a different way. The ramifications were different. You get into the work, embrace that. Bury yourself in this work. Take on everything you can and really impress people, because the effort that it takes to impress people is what's going to ingrain in you how to think and operate as a lawyer. Because our job is ultimately protect your client or get the deal done or make sure you accomplish the legal goal, whether that's a prosecution or a defense or whatever it may be. But you can't do that unless you know everything from top to bottom, what it means and why you're doing it. And you got to work really hard and put in a lot of hours to achieve that. And that's what being a lawyer is, in my opinion, is really being that resource to your client and doing something no one else can do, right?
And when you're in a deal and a problem comes up, you need to be the person in the room that knows how did it start, where did it go to.
Context.
Yeah.
It's so important. Yeah, it's almost like, I've gotten to the point where I visualize deals on the wall. I look up at blank wall and I can visualize them because they're not linear. You've got all kinds of moving parts. You need to know if you changed, and I learned this from doing documents that are 300 pages long, right? If you change something in section 10.2, well, section 26.8 might get impacted, and you need to know that. Now, it's a little easier because you can do searches and you've got coding within documents, but you still need to know that. And if it's words that are interacting, no AI is going to help you with that. That's us. We are the intelligence. It's not artificial. It's real. But that's that devil in the details, and that requires hard work because you have to learn a lot of things in every deal, relearn every single time, but in every single transaction, deal, case, whatever it may be, every nuance of that, so you don't foot fault, because the person on the other side is going to be doing that, right? Or your client's expectation is that something isn't hidden there. And yes, we make mistakes all the time. You learn from those. Very important lessons. Always make mistakes. Don't do them intentionally, but that will happen. But you got to put the time in, and that work ethic is to me what makes the big difference. And most lawyers do have that. You wouldn't have gotten through law school if you didn't, right? It's not a break once you get out and go into the workforce. In fact, it should be even tougher. I loved law school. I had a blast. I love being a lawyer even more.
Yeah, you worked 30 or 40 hours a week during law school, which, showed that you were already at that level.
Yeah.
I
still managed to keep my grades up, so.
Yeah, and the rule was you could only do, we're going to give
20,
out
I think, was the cap, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I had a 20-hour job here and a 20-hour job downtown.
Yeah. Exactly.
It was fine.
Yeah, and there were a lot of people in my class. I'm sure it happens now, but most of us were paying for law school. I had a student loan. It wasn't huge, but and that paid some of the tuition. And I got scholarship. The first year I didn't get anything. The second year I got Katsanas, which took care of my tuition. But then I started living expenses and things like that. But I didn't want to come out with an inordinate amount of debt. And I got married in the middle of first year, so I had a life. My wife was in pharmacy school here, so we had like real adulting going on when we were in law school, and that made a bit of a difference. So I was already preparing myself for life outside of the school environment. I won't tell you that was calculated, but in hindsight, that's how it turned out.
Well, we have something else in common. I got the Katsanas too.
Great, awesome.
Yeah.
So
it was interesting because it was, I think, I don't know what they do today. At the time, I know Al Watson particularly did it for people that got nothing coming in.
Yeah.
That
Al was a very, very good friend of mine.
Yeah,
Yours
mine
too.
too.
He was a great guy.
Yeah, and he would look out for the people that, they got in, but we didn't have to give them anything to get them in.
That's right.
And then did okay, and he's like, okay, we're going to do a few things. But one of them, was Katsanis, where you had to go interview
Exactly.
for it.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, no, I thought we
Baron
just...
Peck and
Yeah.
I forget all the different law firms you had to go to, like 3 of them, I think it was. And you're the senior partner at the law firm. And
Yeah.
what am I going to say wrong?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but yeah, and it's interesting. I have an interesting story about that. The year I worked, I had my job at Fifth Third, second and third year, but first year and an undergraduate, I actually worked for photographic services here on campus, and I did all of the events at the law school. I was a photographer, and I did the alumni magazine and stuff like that. I did all the work for that. Working with Pat Branham, you remember Pat? Mm-hmm. And so I would do all the events, all the receptions and everything that would happen. And the year before, so I was still a first year. I was shooting the reception for Katsanis, and it was actually, interestingly enough, it was held here, Lindner's Reception Center in the middle of campus. And I remember being there, and I'm taking all the candid photos or whatever, and a very prominent lawyer in this city, whom you'll know, personal injury, married to a judge. Federal judge. Anyhow, he walks in, very interesting guy, and I'm standing there, and he hands me his coat. And I looked at the guy. It's a beautiful coat, cashmere polo coat. And I tossed it on the sofa because I'm like, I'm not the hired help, you. And it's totally a tangent, but it was very interesting. I'm going to tell you who the guy is. You'll know who he is. Drove a Bentley. Very, very interesting personal injury lawyer here in town with a very, very interesting reputation.
And
I'll never forget that.
30-some years later, you're still telling the story.
I'm still telling the story.
Yeah.
It had an impact on me. Like, but I bring that up because then the next year, this guy treated me like that, right? And the next year, I'm the recipient of that scholarship. They didn't do the reception every year, so I didn't get a reception. But I think they did them every 2 or 3 years. But regardless, the thing that impacted me is like, don't treat people that way. Even if I was the hired help, you don't come in and just hand me your coat. Who the hell are you? You're a lawyer, whatever. It doesn't matter. None of us are that important. And that was sort of the lesson that stuck with me. It's just like, see, don't treat people that way. And I took it as a lesson to not do that to others. So never look down.
Yeah, my favorite story on that line, in fact, told it before, I'll tell it again, was the firm I worked for in Phoenix was Lewis and Roca. It was the second biggest firm in Phoenix. And long before I got there, one of the administrative assistants was, unbeknownst to the partners, going to law school at night. And 20 years later, she became the general counsel of Arizona Public Service, the largest public utility. And when she was announced and people realized she had worked there, they all trotted across the street to say, okay, we're here for all of our business. And she was like, you and you and you may not come into my office. You treat your secretaries like dirt, and I don't ever want to see you again.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, karma.
Yeah.
Yay.
Just desserts.
Karma sometimes works.
So was that the firm that recruited out of UC?
Yes.
I think that's where, do you remember Kristen Morgan?
No.
So she ended up going to Phoenix. She ended first in our class in '94.
Okay.
But I don't know if it was that firm. But I do remember because that was just an oddball because you had a couple firms outside Cincinnati. There's one in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh that would always recruit Harris something.
Yeah.
And then
Harris Thornburg.
Yes, and then you had the firms, Jones Day out of Columbus, and then you had the big ones here. But UC was never big on that radar. And then this Phoenix one, I'm like, and they just took from the top 10 of the class, and I thought that was odd. But I remember Kristen going there. So.
Yeah, I signed up for the interview because they'd done the Miranda case.
Okay.
And so you're like, well, you got to find out what the people that did the Miranda case. And the reason they came was one of the partners' parents lived here.
Okay.
So he would come see his parents every year. He'd bring an associate along, and they would try and get somebody out of the top 10 to come back.
That's great.
And in my year, the associate that came along for the interview was Janet Napolitano, later governor of Arizona, U.S. Attorney, Department of Homeland Security, just retired as president of the University of California. And I tell you, if you go, oh my God, if that's what their associates are like, and of course there's only one Janet Napolitano, but still.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I've obviously got a lot of affinity for UC, but it's not just because I went here. I do think that the program and the curriculum really does prepare lawyers for practice. It's still different, as I said, in the practicing world versus school, but the prep, it's much less what I call the ivory tower stuff. I'm very proud of having come from UC. I've been across the table from Harvard, Georgetown, Yale, any of these guys, Columbia, Pepperdine. Sorry, I had to do that. Paul, Karen went out there and hated that because he was a great professor. But anyhow, you had him probably too for tax.
No, I was supposed to. Moran was teaching tax that year, and then took a leave, so I got the NKU tax guy.
Oh, okay, all right. But anyhow, I these people are all very book smart, but not terribly practical. And you hear a lot of theory and all of that in the negotiation process, which is completely irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. It's what the paper says and how it relates to the deal or to the company or whatever it may be. And I presume the same thing. I'm not a litigator. I presume the same thing happens with litigation. I love going up against Ivy League people because they look down. They think you went to this small school in the Midwest, and they have to eat my lunch. So
I've always said I would put I would put the top students here up against anybody 100%. In the world. Not like any handicap. I mean, and I've done it. You know, and you've done it.
Yeah. And I'd like to see more people pay attention to UC outside, to give to increase that pool of opportunity because I do think that's important. When we were here, this was a top tier law school. It was and whatever you say about the rankings, the quality of the education I don't think has changed. I think some of the criteria and how it gets assessed by USA Today or whatever has changed a bit, and I do think, and I've said this over the years. I think when we veered sometimes away from our knitting and into more theoretical stuff, I don't know that this is the right school to do that. It's too small. I mean, stick to the knitting, and that's what I love about the school is the size of it. Everybody matters here. And you still got to earn your way. You can't just coast. In some of these big schools, you can't coast, but you can hide. You can end up you can be in the bottom 10% of your class and be president of the United States. So if you go to Penn, I think that was right? But what I'm saying in those big schools, they're also huge. You've got 1,000 students in the school. Our class was 120 graduates. We had 300 students in the whole school. Everybody was on the radar. You all had to work hard and had to achieve, and you still got the same Socratic method, and we had good professors and still do. And I think that being able to be involved like that through your education and being more than a number at a school enhances that. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't get rated, right, in any of these reviews. So anyhow, that was tangent number 38.
No, but that was,
I have lots of views, even ones you don't ask about.
No, I do think that it's important, especially for our students and for the broader legal community, to hear that this school has always and continues to produce super lawyers. And I say to the students, don't feel like there's something that is closed off to you. If you want to be a Supreme Court clerk, I'm sorry, I can't help you. There's only 3 schools that are going to feed that, and that's just the way it is. It's probably not.
Go for the state Supreme Court,
right?
Get a circuit court clerkship, or Sixth Circuit. And we've got enough clout in Cincinnati and at UC to achieve that.
Right.
So,
and the other thing I think that really comes through from your resume as much as anything is you didn't let your first job define you.
No.
And, so many people unfortunately feel like, well, I didn't get X, Y, or Z, and therefore whatever I've dreamed for my law career, it may be an unrealistic dream, and that happens too.
Yeah.
But just because you didn't get the first job you wanted doesn't mean that you have to just put it aside and say, well, I guess I'll just do whatever comes my way.
Yeah, you can define your career. I think what's important is twofold. One, I never have approached any job since I've been a lawyer going into it without having the attitude that I would retire from that place. So I start there, right? I think that's very important. I don't like. Obviously, it's being realistic. There could be some times where there's landing pads you have to take, but I was fortunate enough to be able to approach each opportunity that way. But by doing that, I put everything into it, right, to begin with. But I always kept my sights on what's the best for my long-term career. But I couldn't define that. I couldn't define that. I came into law school wanting to be a litigator. I booked trial practice. It was like, die hard. First time I actually did real litigation, I said, damn, I'm glad I didn't go into that, because it's a grind. It's really, you got to be wired a different way to do that. And I love transactional stuff. But you're not going to know what you're going to actually retire at in your first job, maybe not your second job, but when you're starting your career, because it's going to take its own path. There's so many things that come into play. There's macro things, there's micro things, there's the direction your life takes, where you want to live, who you meet, how the whatever company you're working for does. It could be they go bankrupt or they go gangbusters. I would have never known that MPS, Midwest Payment Systems, would have ended up as Vantiv and WorldPay. And believe me, the lawyer I worked for who stayed there did extremely well, also a UC grad, did extremely well at a very early age. He retired at 45 because of when they spun that out, everyone that was there and there for a long time did extremely well, which is great for them. So you don't know. But what I do advise always is curate your career. Pay attention. If you feel like you've got gaps in your learning, or you're not getting professionally satisfied, and again, that's not because other people aren't satisfied. That's internal. You got to define what that is, and you got to go for it. If you're not professionally developing because you're not pursuing it, then that's on you. If you're trying to pursue it and it's not there, that's when you need to look around. Which is I made these changes. I'll tell you, I created that job at Bank of America when I left. I wasn't at Cadwalader that long. I think it was a couple years. But I actually created the job that I ended up getting at B of A because they were a client of mine. I'm a third, fourth year associate at this big law firm, and I've got my own book of business, and part of it was this thing I created at Bank of America, which was in distressed loan trading. And I looked at it and I saw how much we're billing them, and I went to the business partner at the client, and I said, I can do this for half what you're paying the law firm. I need my role, and I need these two other people, and here's what I think that'll cost you, and here's what we'll need for outside support, and here's what that budget looks like versus what you just paid us last year. And they said, great. Come, when can you join us? and that turned into something absolutely miraculous at Bank of America. I elevated from just managing distressed trading to becoming a principal within our special situations group, and then on to our proprietary desk, and then I became the business manager for all of global markets. And that happened when the world crashed. In 2008, I was with the head of credit, who then was elevated to the head of global markets. We took $1 billion out of the cost structure for our global markets business. I was his primary right-hand person over equities and loan trading and special situations and all of our origination business, everything they did in global markets. And we created, before Jamie Dimon did, we created the bad bank. But just because it was B of A, nobody knew about it. So that was interesting. But again, that's curating your career, seeing opportunities and going for it. And I always kept myself in a hybrid role. That was much more of a business role. But then after, post crash in 08, 09, B of A bought Merrill Lynch, and the power. I was in New York at that time, by the way, so I'd already moved up to New York. But they basically wanted to replace everybody in global markets that was Bank of America and replace them with Merrill Lynch, because they said, well, these are really good guys. I'm like, they drove their company in the ground. What are you talking about? But there were 3 people from that leadership team, myself, the head of credit, and the head of, at that point then, the capital markets group, or global markets group, and everyone else was Merrill Lynch. And I said, I liked the team I worked with. I didn't. These were all the Nations Bank, B of A people, and there was a different stock there, and we weren't just these pretentious Wall Street guys. And so I chose to take my package and leave at that point. Again, looking at what's my career, I definitely could have stayed there for a long time. I was 4 seats removed from the CEO. It was like, it was not a horrible place to be. Professionally, but personally, it was not where I wanted to be. And so I did the same thing. And I made a couple changes. The market was weird, but had lots of opportunities out there. Picked a few of them, but turned into something else.
Have you ever had that? I don't know if it was that way for you, but like for me, professionally, it might be seeming fine. But if waiting for the elevator, it feels like somebody just put an extra 20 pounds on my back. It's like, oh, time to rethink.
Trust your gut.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely have to trust your gut. No one knows what's right for you better than you. You just got to keep your mind and your eyes open, and be introspective and be honest too. You got to be honest with yourself. It's so easy as humans and as professionals to convince yourself that you're in the right situation, especially if you think about it from economics versus pure professional and all that. You got to take it as a whole and always reassess. Every few years, just step back, say, is this going right? Doesn't mean you got to make changes, but what I will tell you is, if you cross that threshold, and this is what people are afraid of, if you cross that threshold in your mind where you say, I just don't think this is right, you start looking and you see a couple jobs out there, you're done. Then go search, because you will never get back to saying, you know what, everything's fine here, because then you're going to feel like you're just settling. If you cross that line and actively look, it's really hard to put that genie back in your own bottle, right? So that's just one thing I would say. If you've done that, you've kind of subconsciously made the decision, you should pursue the search.
Yeah, you're radioactive whether you know it or not.
Yeah.
You might as well, yeah.
Exactly.
Agreed.
Exactly.
You talked a little bit about it being hybrid roles that you were generally in. Explain what a hybrid role means, and how do you separate when you're acting as a lawyer, when you're acting as a business person, or is that just... If someone, by the way, if I asked that question to myself, I'd say it's a silly question.
Yeah. No. You really can't. You try to split your brain. But the hybrid roles that I've been in, by the way, all prepped me for the job I have now, because there's no more hybrid role you can have than really as a general counsel, because your job is to not only be responsible for all legal risk, you generally have a lot of administrative stuff too, and you're doing business stuff. But the hybrid roles I was in were I was a lawyer sitting in the business, so I was embedded in the business. So when I first joined B of A, I came in. Actually, it was the same way at MPS, because we weren't in the legal department, but the 2 lawyers that were there, we sat in the subsidiary. We were employed by the subsidiary. Had no real accountability other than a dotted line to Paul Reynolds was the GC then, to the legal department, and he might not have been the GC. He wasn't. He was the lawyer he became GC. He was the lawyer in the legal department that we had to coordinate with, but he eventually became general counsel. Anyhow, so that was, we were the legal department in the sub, but we were truly embedded in the business. But B of A was the first time I did what I considered like a designed hybrid role. And so we reported to the business, and we were paid by the business. We were bonused by the business, not the legal department. But they forced us to sit in the legal department, and we had a lawyer that we were supervised so that we could maintain the privilege. And they didn't like the fact that if more lawyers saw that happen, the pay structure was very different than in the legal department. And they were paying us more in a capital markets capacity, so we're paid by success. And they were concerned about that would create, is your judgment going to be good and all that? Are you going to just do whatever the business wants because, if you get the deal done, regardless of the risk, you're going to get paid and all that. But I call them hybrid roles because you sit in the business, you're accountable to business, but you are doing both legal, you're responsible for the legal side of it, and this is transactional, so it's very different than I wouldn't have handled litigation for them, things like that. But you're dealing transactionally, and you're making a lot of the calls. You don't actually have to go to the business and say, hey, this is a business or this is a legal question. You just solved them all, and that's really the hybrid role. And as a GC, you do that all the time. I mean, I have to obviously bifurcate things that are truly, it's truly a business deal issue. I don't even know the circumstances or negotiation that took place and on how they set fees and things like that, or some of the parameters. But I've got a lot of latitude in making those decisions. When you're not in the general counsel and you're more of a in the trenches lawyer, that's what I considered the hybrid role. And those always morphed into a business role. It didn't morph into a legal role; it morphed into a business role in all those in those organizations I was in.
Well, and even as general counsel, I mean, when I was GC or a deputy, I was constantly collecting other things. Mm-hmm. Not because I would generally say yes to everything, was part of it.
Yeah.
But part of it was you get a reputation as someone who can think clearly and work your way through problems, and therefore we have this part of the business that doesn't seem to be working terribly well.
You're a problem solver, you're logical, and solution oriented. I mean, that's just really what we're taught. The Socratic method, how we're taught to think, is to get to a solution. It works really well, particularly in a lot of administrative roles and stuff that people don't want to do. So that's why I think you had this too. I have HR, I've got global facilities, I got compliance, I've got all government relations, things like that. And usually any problem child that comes up lands on my desk at some point or another.
Yeah. How did you approach getting into areas that you had no training for? I mean, like HR.
I said I won't take the job unless this person is put in charge of it. And it happened to be someone who I went to school with. We met the first day of intro to law here, and we were in the study group together all 3 years, and I had hired her as my assistant general counsel, so part of my succession plan at Medpace. And she was an HR lawyer and had done HR throughout her whole career. And I said, I'm not going to run HR. I will not do. I'm not competent to do it. And that's the other thing. As lawyers, we're very good about at least assessing in our own brain if you really don't know how to do something. Whether that always comes out and is articulated is another story. But I said I won't do it unless I have this person running it or someone in that role, because I'm not going to do the nuts and bolts of HR. There's an art to that. Everyone's got all their SHRM training and all that type of stuff. I don't do that stuff. Lawyers are good at that, but you need the experience. So that was when I took that on. And same thing with facilities. Is I gotta have somebody who's expert in that, and we have that. Now some of the other ones, compliance, I run directly, but I do have subject matter experts in those roles. And government relations is really, that's kind of me.
Yeah, I remember when I was asked to take on security, and I sat with the head of security and said,
I have that too.
And I said, listen, this is fine. Just so you know, I don't know how to manage security. And he said, that's great, because I manage security. You have to manage me.
That's exactly right. And so when I say I manage these departments, I manage the head of that department.
Right.
But what happens in the trenches, and what's interesting is particularly HR, but facilities a little bit, because we've got properties all over the world, 34, 35 countries, and those are all unique. They'll deal with the business directly a lot. So I don't always know everything they do every day, but I'm an escalation point for problems, and obviously they report up and make sure we know what's happening. HR is a whole other animal, because you're dealing with stuff every day, and a lot I don't want to know about. I want to know when it's approaching a problem and how do we prevent it, or we got a problem, now let's go tackle it. So
I want to make sure that before people have to head
Yeah,
off to
yeah,
class.
people have
That
questions.
if they've got questions, they get them asked.
Do you have any book or podcast recommendations for young lawyers starting out?
Well, this
Other
one,
than corporate law lab?
I think this is one. I wish I could answer that question, but I don't have any idea because, first of all, I don't think there's books. You know, everyone's experience is a little bit different, but I've never looked that up. I'm so far removed from it. You know, I think this is great. I think something like this is good. I don't have any key recommendations for that, and there is no how-to book. If somebody says there's a how-to book, they're full of it, because this is of this, like, you know, some medical professions, a lot of professions, it's on-the-job training. You've got to be in the trenches and experience it, and how you assimilate into what comes at you and how you have to address that. It's individual to each person. I mean, there's some things that you have in common, and there's some advice and direction people can say, hey, take it as it comes, or whatever, or don't, you know, duck feathers. That was something somebody told me. I have these, it's so stupid, but it's not. So it's actually great advice, but there's a lot of stress in this job. And so I had a friend of mine at Cantor Fitzgerald, and if you know the history on Cantor Fitzgerald, you know what a lot of those people went through. Yeah. And he brought me these rubber ducks, and Warren is his name. Really, really wonderful gentleman, very experienced lawyer. He saw the stress I was under at a certain particular point, and he brought me these two rubber ducks, and he goes, duck feathers. I said, what do you mean? He goes, let it roll off your back. You don't need to take it home, whatever. Now, that can mean different things for different people. That was perfectly timed and appropriate for me. I still have the ducks in my office, and this is 15 years ago, right? And but things like that, that's what you're going to experience. It's not going to be from a book or a podcast. It'll be people you work with. It'll be how you adapt and the tools that you gain through that network and through just your personal experience that really are going to define how you work through it. The advice you can get is it's not personal. It's a job and a key responsibility. Don't take it home. Those are the things that I would say. And I'll tell you what, it took me 15 years in my profession to stop taking it home. So that's kind of, you know, not terribly helpful, but a way to articulate it at least.
No, that's incredibly helpful and so practical.
You know, it's interesting on the books. I found myself reading the books that everyone else in the business was reading.
Yeah, that helps a lot.
So, you know, there was a time when everyone was reading Good to Great.
Yeah.
Right? And if you didn't know what a big, hairy, audacious goal was, you'd be like, well, what are they talking about? But if you read Good to Great, you're like, oh, the whole management team is spouting the book this month. That's what they're doing. They all got assigned to it as part of some, but that's probably more useful than finding because the one thing I would say you've seen in the podcast, if you've listened to them all, and I'm sure you have, is we've had a lot of very successful people on who took paths that you couldn't lay out in advance. You couldn't say, this is what I'm going to do. I mean, you know, I'm here as the director of the Corporate Law Center. I did start out as a litigator. I thought I was going to be a trial lawyer. I became a corporate lawyer out of happenstance of one of my investigations caught up the M&A guy, and there were 10 deals in the works. And they're like, well, you know.
By default, you were the lawyer in the room.
You're the guy now. Go to Australia. And like you said about like having confidence, I mean, I knew that deal backwards, forwards, inside out. And, you know, it was like the second deal I'd ever worked on, and it's me and a finance guy in Australia. Nobody to talk to, nobody wants to hear from us anyway. They just want to know that the deal got done. And on like the third day of negotiation, when we were actually closing, somebody said to me in response to something inane that I said, oh, well, you're the expert. I'm like, oh, that's how this works.
Well, you know, they say never let them see you sweat. And
Yeah.
I say, well, they won't see you sweat if you don't. And you won't if you know every detail. But the important nuance on that is just because you know every detail doesn't mean you need to tell every detail. You know it. Right. You got to be smarter than the other person. And smarter doesn't mean that you've got a higher IQ, smarter about the deal or about the case or about whatever it may be, but you don't necessarily have to show that. You just know you know it. And that's going to make all the difference. And that carries in how you, that translates into how you carry yourself, how the negotiation will go, and how you feel. And that's how you're going to present yourself, because you've got to be confident but not cocky. It's a big difference. And confidence needs to be genuine. People will read right through it. Believe me, I read through it all the time. And I love having cocky lawyers on the other side. They will invariably foot fault at some point or another, because it's not real confidence. It's cockiness. It's ego.
So I could probably ask you another 3 hours worth of questions. I think the thing
I could give you 5 hours of answers. So.
The one that I can't let go is moving from financial services into the healthcare space. I mean, I've never seen anybody do that. What was the magic trick that made that come about?
This is about as embarrassing as it gets. The magic trick was Career Builder. I kid you not. I was planning to move to. We had just had kids, living in Manhattan. We had twins, and both my wife and I grew up in Ohio. We're both from Findlay, Ohio. Our yard was Central Park. We said this doesn't work. Couldn't get a twin stroller into the Gristedes, the grocery store. Definitely couldn't get it to Subway. I said, we got to move. We got to move closer to family. And we were between Boston, which is where my sister lives, or here, which is where both my wife and I have family, and our parents were up in Findlay at the time. And so I was working at Brevet. It was a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, special situations hedge fund. I was GC there, and really great job. So I said, we're just going to throw up a shingle in Cincinnati. I said I was going to move here, decided to move here, and they said, great. I said, I can go source deals. I can talk to those people in the Midwest. All these other hedge funds, they're always at the coast. Got to go to the Midwest. You know how much great business is done in the Midwest? I said, I can talk to these people. Absolutely true. And then I arranged to move here. I had rented an apartment in New York. I had flights booked for 6 months out, 2 weeks there, 2 weeks here. I looked at my kids and I said, I'm going to miss half your lives. I can't do that. So I got to find something local. And I just looked in Career Builder and I found this. And I didn't know what a CRO was, but they called me in for an interview. And the reason why they were interested in me is they had just taken in private equity money. And they wanted someone who had this experience, because this was a founder-led company, still is, but this was pre-IPO, pre all that stuff. And they wanted somebody who knew and understood what these PE guys were doing, right? And that was really the goal, and to have that experience. They needed a new GC anyhow, because the GC was leaving. But that was really the catalyst. And came in, had a good interview. They didn't have to move me, so they were really happy about that. And I brought that experience with me. I did have to interview. I was the only person in the company, I think, ever who had to interview with the private equity owners. And so I went to New York. Their offices were in the next building from Brevet's. So I literally walked across the street and went and did the interview. It's turned out really well. But that's what it was. And I've had to learn this business. But that's one of the things that's great about lawyers, is that we're voracious learners, and we love to learn by experience. And I can't thank August Trundle, our CEO, enough for having confidence in me, and allowing me that opportunity despite not having really any experience in the CRO space. But this was really built into something far beyond what I ever imagined, and it's the longest job I've ever had, and far and away, on hold, the best job I've ever had. I absolutely love it, and I do hope this will be the place I work to retirement.
You're on the retirement from this job plan.
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll see if they'll have me. But yes, it is an oddity, and I used to not want to tell that story because it's embarrassing in a certain extent. That I literally found it not through a network, not through a now defunct job board. I don't even think Career Builder's out there anymore. A job board. Right, and it was an absolute fluke. But I was interviewing multiple places here, when I had made that decision. But this was one that I literally picked up off a job board. And thank goodness, I'm glad it was there, and I'm glad it worked out. So
I'm pretty sure I found this job on Indeed,
Okay.
even though I went here.
sure, yeah.
I can't remember exactly where, but I was like.
So it's not dissimilar, right? Yeah.
I mean, I was like looking at it, going, well, why wouldn't I do that?
But the lesson in it is don't close those windows. Don't be like, well, just because it's posted there, it can't be a good job. You never know where you're gonna. Networks are important, but keeping your mind open and just not worrying about some of the pretenses, I think, make a difference. I mean, as lawyers, as professionals, we tend to hold ourselves in a particular esteem. It's not unwarranted, a lot of people don't hold us in that esteem, us and used car dealers. But truly, even though there's jokes about that, most people do respect what it took and the type of effort it takes to maintain a career as a lawyer. But we shouldn't hold ourselves that way all the time. Confidence is one thing, but we're no better than anybody else, and keep your ears open. We work hard. And yes, we were smart. We managed to do well in the LSAT. We passed bar or two or however many exams. Not many bars that we passed. Exams. The joke. Woodies. Okay, we never passed Woodies.
I was a freeze guy. So.
Okay. Well, freeze was good too. They had great darts.
Exactly.
Upstairs. Yeah. Just be as grounded as you can be. I think that's important. Have your confidence. Yes, we know we're smart, but we're no better than anybody else. We just work really hard. In fact, I think lawyers and doctors tend to be people who, while they're held in very high esteem, also work remarkably hard. And we take a lot of risk in what we do because our decisions have impact. They can make or break the survival of a company, whether a client goes to jail or stays out or whatever it may be. That's a lot on your shoulders, but you're doing informed, right? It's not, I'm just great at judgment. And you gotta have good judgment, but you go through the process of getting well informed, understanding the roadmap, the rules, and applying that. That's just work. Same thing as doctors do. You gotta understand how the body works. They have this wealth of knowledge and memory, the ability to research, and then they gotta analyze, right? And then go through deductive reasoning and come to a conclusion.
SGC though, you have to. I guess you don't have to. I had to make calls based on incomplete information all the time.
It happens.
Right?
It happens.
I remember having somebody that worked for me once say to somebody else that worked for me, and it got back to me, I can't believe he's that lucky because he makes these decisions based on not knowing everything, and they work out most of the time. And I'm like, well, yeah, but that's not something I always had.
No, you get that from experience, but I also think it's the quickness because it may be incomplete information, but you're able to get further with the limited information you got because of the way you reason and apply it. I mean, I look at a lot of business leaders that are like that, really smart people, Elon Musk, August, who I work for, smartest people I know. And they make decisions on a lot of limited information, and you do think it's luck. It's not. It's actually they're able to process many more details even with that limited information and apply that extremely fast and get it right most of the time because they had enough details. Maybe not all of them, but they had enough. And they had a pretty good idea what those missing details how they fell.
Yeah. So it's not just gut feel. It is gut feel informed by experience,
right,
and talent.
Yeah. Well, and here's the other thing that I think is and I know you'll relate to this as well. By the time you get to a role at GC or senior lawyer, you have leverage, and when you're sitting in a leverage situation, leverage meaning you've got people. What you're not doing is writing the documents and distracted by the commas and the dotted I's. So the ability to see the picture undistracted by the minutia, to me has opened myself up to significantly more capacity. And believe me, I get very frustrated when I have to dig into the minutia, and it happens. But I'm not that good at that anymore, or doing both. And when you're not distracted by that, and this is the same thing with a lot of business leaders, they're able to get right to these because they don't have to write the PowerPoints, they don't have to come up with the talking points, they don't have to do any of that stuff. You got people that do that within the organization or that execute on the bigger plan, right? That leverage, to me, creates a tremendous amount of capacity for a leader like yourself, like me, to be able to be better at making those judgment calls because I'm not distracted about what paper it's going on or how people are going to, how do I phrase that, particularly. Right. And it's the same thing, editor. I'm a far better editor than I am a raw writer because I got something to work with and I can focus on the things that matter, and I'm not distracted by the things that, while important, aren't what I should be distracted by because they do take away from making those decisions. That's why you need that leverage. So, which is why, if I can put a plug in, I'm hiring. So I'm always looking for people and hiring lawyers. So it'd be great to have someone hear this that goes, hey, Medpace might be a cool place to work.
So do you, having come straight out of law school and do an in-house role, do you want to hire people straight out of law school?
I will.
Or do you? Okay.
Yeah, I really like. We were the first ones, I think, to do the fellowship here. I'm a real champion of that because it gives us an opportunity to evaluate and say, hey, you might have the right stuff. I've hired 2 out of fellowships who've gone on. Not with me, so it's not working for me for retention, but they've gone on even kind of bigger jobs, which is great. I'm very happy for them in that regard. But it also creates an opportunity for the law student to get some real world experience. And I've said, you come in even if you just do the fellowship and we decide not to proceed. You've got more experience than any other first years coming out that next year because you got real world experience. And it's not real world experience because, well, you took the last job that was available, so you're looking for another one. You actually chose to get the experience. It's like the co-op. It's like a real co-op because it's even different than summer clerkships because you've done it while you're licensed, right? So you actually got to do the work. And I think that's a really valuable component. It's the equivalent of the first year associate type approach that law firms, I don't even know if they still do as much of that because it seems like they've cut back a lot. But I really like that fellowship because it's agreed. It's only going to be this long. We could always extend it, but it's only going to be this long. It gives us a trial run. But it was a choice to get the experience. And that's what the student has the opportunity to put on their resume and say, yes, I made the choice to do this. And then we have an opportunity to see if maybe you have the right stuff to be able to, in an environment with very little training, take on a role. And that's really what it is. We're not equipped to train. So if I've got people that have the stuff that can self-learn and navigate like I did, right? Not knowing I could do it, but right. Through experience, it's a great opportunity for that. So we bring in fellows too, and I think we've got 1 or 2 slots for this year, and we're definitely keen. And that's just UC. It's the only place I do it. I don't do it at Ohio State. I don't do it at NKU. Just UC. So
fantastic. So you'll be back in a couple of weeks for the Corporate Law Symposium.
I got to do some studying before that.
And we'll figure out the parking in the meantime.
No worries.
But we look forward to having you back. I think.
Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a great and unbelievably timely to talk about administrative law issues.
Oh my goodness! Yes.
In this climate.
What I can tell you, it is actually top on. We're doing our proxy right now. I'm dealing with securities lawyers every day, and you're seeing dramatic changes like this. I think the SEC, it's going to turn significantly. All the DEI stuff, regardless of how you feel about it, to see companies pivot so immediately and see the SEC remove some of these things. And I think you're going to see with other regulators. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but the administration change with that legal opinion coming down in tandem is going to have a tremendous impact on the regulatory environment. I hope as a human that it doesn't go too far, But I think it's something that is probably pretty important constitutionally. So we'll talk in more detail about that. May have to take another approach, or Congress just might have to do their job. So
That's all good reasons to come to the Corporate Law Symposium and find out what the answers are to these and many other questions.
sounds great.
Thank you again, Steve.
Thank you. Take care.